In 1947, thousands of German women crossed the Atlantic dreaming of American paradise. What they found instead would break them, or forge them into something stronger than steel. Bremerhaven Harbor stretched before Margaret Hoffman like a gateway between two worlds. Salt spray mixed with diesel fumes as the SS Marine Flasher groaned against its moorings, ready to carry its cargo of hope across an ocean. Greta clutched her single battered suitcase, everything she owned compressed into one small leather rectangle. Inside lay a worn cloth doll from her childhood, 3 photographs of her mother, and the carefully folded letters from Corporal James Walker, promising her a life beyond the rubble. Hamburg lay behind her in ruins. The firebombing of 1943 had turned her neighborhood into a moonscape of twisted metal and pulverized brick. For 4 years, Greta had picked through debris, stood in ration lines for moldy bread, and watched her father waste away from tuberculosis in their half-destroyed apartment. When the Americans arrived in 1945, they brought chocolate, cigarettes, and the possibility of escape. Jim had been different from the other soldiers. He didn't leer or make crude propositions. He brought her real coffee and asked about her life before the war. He told her about Alabama, about wide-open spaces and a house with a porch where they could sit in the evenings. He showed her a photograph of green fields and promised her she would never be hungry again. When he proposed in broken German, kneeling in the ruins of the rat house, Greta said yes without hesitation. Anything was better than staying in this graveyard of a country. The War Brides Act of 1945 had opened the door for women like her. The American government wanted to reunite soldiers with their foreign wives to reward the men who had won the war. Greta had endured months of paperwork, invasive medical examinations, and FBI background checks. They tested her for venereal diseases, tuberculosis, and political affiliations. They asked if she had been a Nazi party member, if her father had served in the Wehrmacht, if she understood that marriage to an American soldier did not automatically grant her citizenship. She answered every humiliating question, because the alternative was staying in Germany, where women who had fraternized with Allied soldiers were called Ami Liebchen and spat upon in the streets. Now she stood on the dock with 200 other war brides, a United Nations of desperate women. Italian girls with dark eyes and rosary beads. British women with stiff upper lips and sensible shoes. A handful of Japanese brides who kept to themselves, facing even harsher judgment than the Germans. But the largest group came from Germany and Austria, women who had married the enemy's conquerors, women who were leaving behind a country that no longer wanted them. Greta recognized Helga Schneider from the processing center at Camp Kilmer. Helga was 19, blonde and pregnant, her belly just starting to show beneath her threadbare coat. Her husband was a farm boy from Texas who had promised her a ranch. Helga couldn't stop talking about cowboys and wide-open spaces, about a land where the war had never touched. Beside Helga stood Liesel Braun, 25 and rail-thin, her face still bearing the hollow look of starvation. Liesel's husband was from Wisconsin, a place she couldn't pronounce. She had met him in a displaced persons camp where she had ended up after fleeing the Soviet zone. She didn't talk much about what had happened to her during the Russian occupation, but her eyes told the story. The ship's horn blasted, a sound that seemed to split the world in two. Greta climbed the gangplank with her suitcase banging against her knees. The deck was crowded with women and children, babies crying, toddlers clinging to their mother's skirts. The crew directed them below to cramped quarters that smelled of diesel fuel and vomit. Greta found herself assigned to a cabin with 7 other women, metal bunks stacked 3 high, a single porthole providing dim light. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. The ship rolled and pitched through winter storms. Women vomited into buckets, too sick to eat the unfamiliar American food served in the mess hall. Greta spent hours on deck when the weather allowed, watching the gray water stretch endlessly in all directions. She tried to imagine Jim's face, but found that his features had already begun to blur in her memory. They had known each other for only 6 months before he shipped back to the States. Their courtship had consisted of stolen afternoons in bombed-out cafes and desperate kisses in doorways. She knew he liked baseball and hated coffee and had a scar on his left shoulder from shrapnel. But did she know him? Did she know what kind of man he really was? Helga remained optimistic despite the seasickness. She talked endlessly about her future ranch, about learning to ride horses, about raising her baby under the big Texas sky. Liesel was more pragmatic. She had survived too much to indulge in fantasy. She told Greta that she expected hardship, that she knew life in America wouldn't be easy, but at least there would be food and safety. At least the Russians wouldn't come in the night. On the 8th day, a woman named Rosa from Dusseldorf told them about her cousin who had come over the previous year. The cousin had expected to live in New York City, but had ended up in rural Kentucky, in a house with no electricity or running water. She had written home begging for money to return to Germany, but there was no money. And besides, what was there to return to? Rosa's voice dropped to a whisper as she shared this story, as if speaking the words too loudly might make them come true for all of them. Greta pushed the fear away. Jim had promised her a house. He had shown her a photograph. She clung to that image like a talisman. The Statue of Liberty appeared through morning fog on the 12th day. The women crowded the deck, pointing and crying. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Greta stared at the massive green figure holding her torch aloft and felt something crack open in her chest. This was America. This was freedom. This was the future. Camp Kilmer in New Jersey processed them like cattle. More medical examinations, more paperwork, more waiting. The Red Cross provided coffee and donuts. Volunteers tried to teach them English phrases. Hello? Thank you. Where is the bathroom? The words felt strange in Greta's mouth, her tongue stumbling over unfamiliar sounds. Jim arrived on the 3rd day. Greta almost didn't recognize him. He had gained weight, his face fuller than she remembered. He wore civilian clothes that looked cheap and ill-fitting. When he hugged her, he smelled of cigarettes and something else, something sharp and medicinal that she couldn't identify. His kiss was brief and awkward, his eyes not quite meeting hers. They took a bus south. Jim didn't talk much during the journey. He stared out the window and smoked one cigarette after another. Greta tried to ask him questions about their home, about his family, about what their life would be like, but his answers were short and vague. He seemed nervous, his leg bouncing constantly, his fingers drumming against the armrest. The landscape changed as they traveled deeper into Alabama. The cities gave way to small towns, then to endless stretches of farmland and forest. The roads became narrower, the pavement giving way to dirt. Greta saw poverty she hadn't expected in America. Shacks with rusted tin roofs, barefoot children playing in yards full of broken machinery, signs she couldn't read advertising chewing tobacco and revival meetings. Jim's mother lived outside a town called Calhoun, population 800. The house was not the house from the photograph. That house, Jim finally admitted, belonged to his uncle. This house was a sharecropper's cabin, 2 rooms with gaps between the boards wide enough to see daylight. The roof sagged in the middle. The porch steps were rotted through. An outhouse stood 50 feet away, its door hanging crooked on broken hinges. Greta stood in the dirt yard and felt the earth tilt beneath her feet. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the place where she was supposed to live. Jim wouldn't look at her. He grabbed her suitcase and carried it inside without a word. The interior was worse than the exterior. A wood stove in one corner, a table with mismatched chairs, a sagging bed covered with a stained quilt. No electricity, no running water. A pump in the yard provided water that tasted of rust and minerals. The walls were papered with old newspapers to keep out the wind. Greta could read the headlines from 1943, stories about battles her father had died in. Jim's mother, Ethel Walker, was a hard woman with suspicious eyes and a mouth like a knife wound. She looked Greta up and down and said something in rapid English that Greta couldn't understand. Jim translated reluctantly. His mother wanted to know if Greta could cook, if she could work, if she understood that this wasn't Germany, and people here didn't tolerate laziness. That first night, Greta lay beside Jim in the narrow bed and cried silently into the thin pillow. Jim pretended to sleep. Outside, insects screamed in the darkness, sounds she had never heard before. The heat was oppressive even after sunset, the air thick and wet, so different from the dry cold of Hamburg. She thought about her mother, alone in the ruins. She thought about the ship that had brought her here, now sailing back across the Atlantic without her. She thought about the photograph Jim had shown her, the lie that had brought her to this place. In the morning, she discovered that Jim had no job. He had been discharged from the army 6 months earlier and had been living with his mother, doing odd jobs for neighbors, drinking away what little money he earned. The house they were supposed to have didn't exist. The future he had promised was a fantasy he had constructed to convince a desperate German girl to marry him. Ethel put Greta to work immediately, hauling water from the pump, scrubbing clothes on a washboard, hoeing the vegetable garden in the brutal sun. Greta's hands, already rough from years of hardship in Germany, cracked and bled. Her back ached. The heat made her dizzy and nauseous. She understood perhaps 1 word in 10 of what Ethel said to her, but the tone was always the same: contemptuous, impatient, cruel. The neighbors came to stare at the German bride. They stood in the yard and spoke about her as if she couldn't hear them, even though she was right there hanging laundry on the line. They called her the Nazi wife. They asked Jim if he had checked her for a swastika tattoo. They wondered aloud why any American boy would bring home a kraut when there were plenty of good Christian American girls who needed husbands. Greta learned to keep her head down and her mouth shut. She learned that speaking German, even to herself, brought harsh looks and harsher words. She learned that her accent marked her as foreign, as enemy, as less than human. She learned that the war might be over in Europe, but here in rural Alabama, it was still being fought every day in small acts of cruelty and exclusion. Jim changed as the weeks passed. The nervous, awkward man who had picked her up at Camp Kilmer disappeared, replaced by someone darker and more volatile. He drank every night, cheap whiskey that he bought from a man who made it in the woods. He came home late, stumbling and angry, and Greta learned to make herself small and quiet. She learned which of his moods meant he would pass out on the bed and which meant she needed to hide. The first time he hit her was in July, 3 months after her arrival. She had burned the cornbread, distracted by trying to understand a conversation between Jim and his mother. Jim backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling against the stove. The heat from the metal seared her arm. Ethel watched without expression and told Greta to clean up the mess. Greta locked herself in the outhouse and sobbed until she vomited. She had survived the bombing of Hamburg. She had survived starvation and occupation. She had crossed an ocean to escape the ruins of Germany, and now she was trapped in a different kind of hell, one she had walked into willingly, one she had no way to escape. She had no money. She had no family in America. She had no legal status independent of Jim. The War Brides Act had allowed her to enter the country, but her right to stay depended on her marriage. If she left Jim, she could be deported back to Germany, back to the ruins and the hunger and the shame of being a woman who had failed at her one chance for a better life. So she stayed. She learned to read Jim's moods, to anticipate his anger, to make herself invisible when he was drinking. She learned to cook the strange American food, to speak enough English to understand basic commands, to navigate the unspoken rules of this alien place. In August, she discovered she was pregnant. The realization came with a wave of terror so profound she couldn't breathe. She was going to bring a child into this nightmare. She was going to tie herself to Jim and to this place forever. There would be no escape now, no possibility of return, no hope of a different future. She told Jim on a night when he was sober, hoping for some spark of joy or responsibility. He stared at her for a long moment, then walked out of the house. He didn't come back for 3 days. When he returned, he was drunk and broke and said nothing about the baby. Ethel was more practical. She told Greta that babies were expensive and that Greta would need to work right up until her time came. There would be no lying around, no special treatment. Women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and it wasn't an excuse for laziness. The Baptist church in town organized a charity drive for the German war bride. Greta learned about it when the pastor's wife appeared at the door with a box of used maternity clothes and a basket of canned goods. The woman spoke slowly and loudly, as if Greta were deaf or simple-minded. She explained that the church community wanted to help, that they were good Christian people who believed in charity even for former enemies. The humiliation of accepting that charity burned worse than any physical pain. Greta smiled and said, "Thank you" in her broken English and took the box of someone else's worn-out dresses. After the pastor's wife left, she sat on the porch steps and stared at the dirt yard and wondered if there was any limit to how low a person could sink. In September, she met Rosa Benedetti at the general store in town. Rosa was Italian, a war bride who had arrived the previous year. She lived 10 miles away with her husband, a veteran who worked at the lumber mill. Rosa's English was better than Greta's, and she translated when the store clerk made a joke about foreign women taking American men. They sat on the bench outside the store and shared their stories in a mixture of English, German, and Italian, filling in the gaps with gestures and expressions. Rosa's situation was similar to Greta's. Her husband drank. His family resented her. The community treated her with suspicion and contempt. She was pregnant with her second child and had no money and no way to leave. But Rosa had found other war brides in the area. There were 7 of them within a 20-mile radius, women from Germany, Italy, and Austria, who had all come seeking the American dream and found something much darker. They met once a month at Rosa's house, sharing food and stories and the comfort of not being alone. Rosa invited Greta to the next meeting. Greta walked the 5 miles to Rosa's house on a Sunday afternoon when Jim was passed out drunk and Ethel was at church. The house was barely better than the cabin where Greta lived, but it felt like a palace because of the warmth inside. 6 women sat around Rosa's kitchen table. They ranged in age from 18 to 35. They spoke different languages and came from different countries, but they shared the same haunted look, the same exhaustion, the same desperate need for connection. Greta learned their stories. Anna from Munich, whose husband had abandoned her 2 months after she arrived, leaving her alone with a newborn in rural Mississippi. Sophia from Rome, whose mother-in-law poisoned her food and told neighbors she was trying to corrupt the family with Catholic witchcraft. Brigitte from Vienna, whose husband beat her so badly she had lost hearing in one ear. Maria from Naples, whose husband had died in a factory accident, leaving her with 3 children and no income. And then there was Helga, sweet, optimistic Helga from the ship, who had been so excited about her Texas ranch. Helga had died in childbirth in a farmhouse 50 miles from the nearest hospital. Her husband had tried to deliver the baby himself. Both mother and child had bled to death on a kitchen table while he rode to fetch help that arrived too late. The news hit Greta like a physical blow. She remembered Helga on the ship, talking about cowboys and wide-open spaces, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. She remembered Helga's smile, her hope, her absolute certainty that everything would be wonderful in America. The women sat in silence for a long moment. Then Rosa poured coffee, and they began to talk about practical matters, how to stretch $1, how to treat injuries without a doctor, how to hide money from husbands who would drink it away, how to survive. Greta walked home as the sun set, her feet aching, her pregnant belly heavy, but something had shifted inside her. She wasn't alone. There were other women fighting the same battle, women who understood what it meant to be trapped between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. The winter of 1947 came hard and cold. The cabin had no insulation, and wind blew through the gaps in the walls. Greta stuffed rags and newspaper into the cracks, but it barely helped. She wore every piece of clothing she owned, layered one on top of another, and still shivered through the nights. The wood stove provided some heat, but wood was expensive and Jim rarely brought enough home. Her pregnancy became more difficult as the months passed. Her ankles swelled. Her back ached constantly. She was exhausted all the time but couldn't sleep because the baby kicked and Jim snored and the cold kept her awake. Ethel showed no sympathy. Pregnancy wasn't a disease, she said. Women had been working through pregnancy since Eve. In January, Greta collapsed while carrying water from the pump. She woke up in the dirt yard with Ethel standing over her, shaking her head in disgust. The neighbor woman, Mrs. Patterson, had seen the fall and came over to help. She was a widow in her 60s, weathered and stern, but her hands were gentle as she helped Greta into the house. Mrs. Patterson spoke to Ethel in sharp tones that Greta couldn't fully understand, but the meaning was clear. The girl needed rest. The girl needed food. The girl was going to lose the baby if something didn't change. Ethel argued back, but Mrs. Patterson was unmoved. She returned the next day with a pot of soup and a loaf of bread. She came back the day after that with a blanket and a jar of honey. Greta didn't understand why this woman was helping her. Mrs. Patterson had lost her son in the war, killed in France in 1944. She had every reason to hate Germans, but she kept coming, bringing food and supplies, sitting with Greta in the afternoons, teaching her English words and phrases. One day, as they sat by the wood stove, Mrs. Patterson told Greta her story. She had come to Alabama as a young bride herself, from Tennessee, and had been treated as an outsider for years. Her husband had been a hard man, quick with his fists and slow with affection. She had survived by learning to be harder than the hardship, by refusing to break no matter what life threw at her. She saw something of herself in Greta, she said. She saw a woman who was stronger than she knew. Jim disappeared for a week in February. He left without a word and returned without explanation, broke and hungover and mean. Greta had learned not to ask questions. She had learned that silence was safer than curiosity. But his absence had been almost peaceful, and his return filled the cabin with tension that made her stomach clench. The baby came in March, 3 weeks early, on a night when Jim was drunk and Ethel was visiting her sister. Greta's water broke as she was washing dishes. The pain came fast and hard, doubling her over. She managed to get to the bed before the contractions became unbearable. Mrs. Patterson arrived within an hour, summoned by some instinct or divine intervention. She brought the midwife, a black woman named Esther, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Esther's presence was illegal in some contexts, Jim's mother had once explained, because she wasn't a licensed doctor and because she was colored. But in emergencies, people forgot about such rules. The labor lasted 14 hours. Greta screamed in German, calling for her mother, begging for it to stop. Esther and Mrs. Patterson worked with calm efficiency, boiling water, preparing cloths, coaching Greta through each contraction. Jim stayed outside, drinking and pacing. Ethel never came. The baby was a girl, small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly. Greta held her daughter and cried, overwhelmed by love and terror in equal measure. She had brought a child into this world, into this poverty and hardship and uncertainty. What kind of life could she give this tiny, perfect creature? She named her Anna, after her mother. Jim came in to look at the baby, swaying drunk, and said she looked like a walker. Then he left again. Mrs. Patterson stayed through the night, helping Greta nurse, changing the baby's clothes, making sure mother and child were stable. In the morning, Esther returned to check on them. She examined Greta and the baby with practiced hands and declared them both healthy. As she was leaving, she pressed a small cloth bag into Greta's hand. Inside were herbs for tea, she explained, to help with milk production and healing. She also included a tiny carved wooden bird, a gift for the baby, a symbol of hope and flight. Greta's recovery was slow. Her body ached. Nursing was painful. She was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. But Anna gave her something she hadn't had before, a reason to survive that went beyond mere survival. This child needed her. This child depended on her. She couldn't give up, couldn't break, couldn't fail. Jim's drinking got worse after Anna's birth. He resented the baby's crying, the attention Greta gave to the child, the expense of another mouth to feed. He stayed away more often, sometimes for days at a time. Greta learned to be grateful for his absences. One night in April, Jim came home in a rage. He had lost his job at the lumber mill for showing up drunk. He blamed Greta, blamed the baby, blamed the world. He threw dishes against the wall and overturned the table. Greta grabbed Anna and ran outside, hiding in the darkness behind the outhouse until Jim passed out. She sat in the dirt with her baby clutched to her chest and realized that she had reached a breaking point. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't raise her daughter in this environment. Something had to change, or they would both be destroyed. The next day, she walked to Mrs. Patterson's house with Anna wrapped in a blanket. She asked in her broken English if there was any way to make money, any work she could do. Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, then nodded. She knew women in town who needed sewing done, alterations and mending and simple dressmaking. If Greta could sew, there might be work. Greta could sew. Her mother had taught her back in Hamburg in the years before the war. She had made her own clothes, had mended and altered and created beauty from scraps. Her hands remembered the skills even if her mind had tried to forget everything about her old life. Mrs. Patterson spread the word. Within a week, Greta had her first commission, hemming a dress for the pastor's wife. The pay was small, but it was hers. She hid the money in the lining of her suitcase, the one she had brought from Germany, the one that held her cloth doll and her photographs, and the last remnants of who she used to be. The sewing work grew slowly. A hem here, a button there, a simple alteration. The women of Calhoun were suspicious of the German war bride, but they were also practical. Greta's work was good, and her prices were fair. Word spread. More work came. Jim noticed the money eventually. He demanded she give it to him, said it was his right as her husband. Greta refused for the first time in their marriage. She stood in that cabin with her baby on her hip and said no in English, clearly and firmly. Jim raised his hand to hit her, and Mrs. Patterson walked through the door. What Mrs. Patterson said to Jim that day, Greta never fully understood. But Jim lowered his hand and walked out, and he never asked for her sewing money again. Mrs. Patterson had power in this community, the power of a woman who had lived here for 40 years and knew everyone's secrets. She had chosen to use that power to protect Greta, and Jim was smart enough not to challenge her. The months passed. Anna grew. Greta's English improved. Her sewing business expanded. She was still poor, still trapped in a loveless marriage, still living in a cabin with gaps in the walls, but she had carved out a small space of autonomy, a tiny measure of control over her own life. She attended the War Brides meetings regularly now, walking the miles to Rosa's house once a month. The women shared their victories and defeats. Anna from Mississippi had found work cleaning houses and was saving money to move to a city. Sophia from Rome had convinced her husband to move away from his poisonous mother. Brigitte from Vienna had left her abusive husband and was living in a shelter run by Catholic nuns. And Liesel, quiet Liesel from the ship, had remarried. Her first husband had died of pneumonia, leaving her alone in Wisconsin. A widowed farmer with 3 children had needed a wife, and Liesel had needed security. It was a practical arrangement, not a love match, but Liesel seemed content. She had food and shelter and a man who didn't beat her. In their world, that counted as success. The news about Liesel sparked a conversation among the women about the nature of survival and compromise. How much of yourself could you sacrifice and still remain yourself? How much could you endure before you broke? Where was the line between strength and surrender? Greta didn't have answers to these questions. She only knew that she woke up every morning and chose to keep going. She fed her daughter and did her sewing and survived another day. That was all she could manage, and somehow it was enough. Jim got a job at a different lumber mill in the summer of 1949. The work was hard and the pay was poor, but it was steady. He drank less, or at least he drank at different times, not in the mornings before work. He was never kind to Greta, never affectionate, but the violence decreased. They existed in the same space like two strangers sharing a bus seat, connected by circumstance but not by choice. Anna took her first steps in September. She said her first word in October, "Mama." Greta wept with joy and grief because her daughter's first word was in English, not German. Anna would grow up American, would never know the country her mother came from, would never understand the language or the culture or the history that had shaped Greta's early life. Greta had stopped speaking German entirely. There was no one to speak it with, and it only brought suspicion and hostility. She thought in English now, dreamed in English, even prayed in English when she prayed at all. Her German self was fading, becoming a ghost, a memory of a person who had existed in another lifetime. Mrs. Patterson taught her to read English using the Bible. They sat together in the afternoons while Anna napped, and Greta stumbled through verses about suffering and redemption. The words were difficult, but Greta was determined. Reading opened doors. Reading meant she could understand contracts and newspapers and signs. Reading meant she could help Anna with schoolwork someday. Reading meant power. The Korean War started in 1950, and suddenly being German was less of a liability. The enemy was now communist, and Germany was divided between East and West, with West Germany becoming an American ally. The shift in geopolitics didn't erase the prejudice Greta faced, but it softened it slightly. She was no longer the Nazi wife. She was the German wife, and Germany was now on the right side of the new conflict. Rosa's husband died in 1951, crushed by falling lumber at the mill. Rosa was left with 3 children and no income. The company paid a small death benefit, but it wasn't enough to live on. Rosa made the decision to move to Chicago, where her cousin had found work in a factory. The War Brides group threw her a farewell party, pooling their resources to give her money for the bus ticket and a fresh start. Greta felt Rosa's departure like a physical loss. Rosa had been her first friend in America, her lifeline in the darkest times, but she understood the decision. Rosa was doing what she had to do to survive, to give her children a chance at something better. That was what mothers did. They sacrificed, they endured, they found a way. The years blurred together. Anna started school. Jim's mother died, and Jim inherited the cabin and the small plot of land it sat on. Greta's sewing business grew large enough that she could afford to buy a used sewing machine, a luxury that made her weep when Mrs. Patterson helped her carry it home. She made curtains for the cabin's windows, the first real decoration the place had ever had. Jim's health declined. Years of drinking and hard labor took their toll. He developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. The doctor said his liver was damaged, that he needed to stop drinking, but Jim ignored the advice. He was 42 years old and looked 60. Greta felt nothing when she looked at him. Not love, not hate, just a vast emptiness. He was the man who had brought her to America with lies and promises. He was the father of her child. He was a stranger she had lived with for 18 years. When he died in 1965, she felt relief more than grief. The funeral was small. Jim's remaining family came, distant cousins and an uncle Greta had never met. They were polite but cold. Mrs. Patterson attended, sitting beside Greta in the church pew, a silent show of support. Anna, now 17, cried for the father she had barely known, the man who had been a ghost in their house, present but absent, alive but not living. After the funeral, Greta found herself alone in the cabin for the first time in years. Anna had gone to stay with a school friend. The silence was profound. Greta sat at the kitchen table and looked around at the space that had been her prison and her home for nearly 2 decades. She pulled her old suitcase from under the bed, the one she had brought from Germany. The leather was cracked and faded, the handle held together with wire. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the cloth doll from her childhood. She held it in her hands and remembered the girl she had been. The girl who had boarded a ship in Bremerhaven with hope in her heart and stars in her eyes. That girl was gone. She had died somewhere in the crossing, or in the first moment Greta saw the cabin, or in one of the 1,000 small deaths that came with survival. In her place was this woman, this stranger with rough hands and a lined face, and a daughter who spoke only English. Anna came home the next day and found Greta sitting on the porch with the doll in her lap. She sat down beside her mother and asked about it. Greta had never talked about Germany, had never shared stories of her life before America. It was too painful, too distant, too much like opening a wound that had barely healed. But now, with Jim gone and Anna nearly grown, Greta found the words. She told her daughter about Hamburg, about the bombing and the hunger and the ruins. She told her about meeting Jim, about the promises he had made, about the hope she had carried across the ocean. She told her about the shock of arrival, about the poverty and the prejudice and the loneliness. She told her about Helga and Rosa and Mrs. Patterson and all the women who had helped her survive. Anna listened with tears streaming down her face. She had known her mother's life was hard, but she hadn't understood the depth of the sacrifice, the magnitude of the loss. She held Greta's hand and said she was sorry. Sorry for not knowing. Sorry for not understanding. Sorry that her mother had suffered so much. Greta shook her head. She wasn't looking for pity or apologies. She was simply sharing the truth, passing on the story so it wouldn't be lost. Anna needed to know where she came from, needed to understand that her existence had been bought with her mother's dreams and paid for with her mother's pain. They sat together on the porch as the sun set, mother and daughter, German and American, past and future. Greta felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and anger she had carried for so long. She had survived. Against all odds, despite all hardship, she had survived. And she had raised a daughter who was strong and smart and free in ways Greta had never been. That was enough. It had to be enough. Years later, when Anna was in her 60s and Greta had been gone for a decade, Anna would participate in an oral history project about war brides. She would sit in front of a camera and tell her mother's story, adding it to the archive of thousands of similar stories, women who had crossed oceans seeking paradise and found something much more complicated. The interviewer would ask if Greta had ever regretted coming to America. Anna would pause, considering the question carefully. Regret was too simple a word for what her mother had felt. There had been moments of profound despair. Yes, moments when Greta had wished she could undo her choice. But there had also been moments of unexpected joy, of hard-won triumph, of love for the daughter she had brought into the world. Greta had told Anna once, near the end of her life, that she had learned something important in America. She had learned that survival was not the same as living, but sometimes survival was all you had, and you had to find a way to transform it into something more. She had learned that strength was not about never breaking, but about finding a way to put yourself back together after you shattered. She had learned that home was not a place, but a choice you made every day, a decision to keep going even when everything in you wanted to stop. 20,000 German war brides came to America between 1945 and 1950. Their stories were as varied as the women themselves. Some found happiness and prosperity. Some found tragedy and despair. Most found something in between, a life that was neither the dream they had imagined nor the nightmare they had feared, but a complicated reality that required every ounce of strength they possessed. Many of these women never spoke about their experiences. They buried their German identities, their losses, their disappointments. They became American wives and mothers, blending into communities that had once rejected them, raising children who never knew the full truth of their mother's sacrifices. But the stories existed, preserved in letters and diaries, in oral histories and family memories, in the quiet strength of women who had survived the unsurvivable. These were women who had lived through war and occupation, who had crossed an ocean on faith and hope, who had endured poverty and prejudice and isolation, and who had somehow found a way to build lives from the rubble of their dreams. Greta's story was one among thousands, neither the worst nor the best, but representative of a particular kind of immigrant experience. She had come seeking the American dream and had found the American reality, a reality that was harder and more complex than any dream could capture. She had paid a price for her survival, had sacrificed parts of herself that could never be recovered. But she had also discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, had forged connections with other women that sustained her through the darkest times, had raised a daughter who carried forward the legacy of resilience. In the end, that was what the war brides left behind. Not just children and grandchildren, but a testament to the human capacity for endurance. They had been broken by their experiences, yes, but they had also been forged into something stronger. They had learned to survive in a world that didn't want them, to build lives from nothing, to find meaning in the midst of suffering. Their stories deserve to be told, not as tales of victimhood, but as narratives of survival and strength. They had crossed an ocean seeking paradise and found tragedy, but they had also found themselves, had discovered what they were capable of when pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. Greta Hoffman Walker died in 1995 at the age of 71. She was buried in the Calhoun Cemetery beside Jim, though she had long since stopped thinking of herself as his wife. Anna placed the cloth doll from Hamburg in the casket, a final connection to the girl her mother had been before America, before hardship, before survival became the only goal. At the funeral, Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter spoke about Greta's kindness, about the sewing she had done for the community, about the quiet dignity with which she had lived her life. The eulogy made no mention of Germany or the war or the struggles Greta had faced. It painted a picture of a woman who had been a good neighbor, a devoted mother, a skilled seamstress. It was a sanitized version of the truth, the kind of story communities tell themselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities. But Anna knew the real story. She carried it with her, along with her mother's worn German passport and the faded photograph of Jim in his army uniform, the photograph he had shown Greta in Hamburg, along with his lies about the house and the future. She kept these artifacts as reminders of the price her mother had paid, the dreams that had been sacrificed, the strength that had been required simply to survive. The German war brides were a footnote in history, a small detail in the larger story of World War II and its aftermath. But for the women who lived it, it was the defining experience of their lives. They had been young and desperate and hopeful, and they had made choices that would shape everything that came after. Some of those choices led to happiness, some led to tragedy, most led to something in between, a life that required constant negotiation between past and present, between who they had been and who they had to become. They came seeking the American dream. What they found was the American reality, in all its complexity and contradiction. And somehow, against all odds, many of them survived. That survival, hard-won and costly, was its own kind of triumph. It was a testament to the strength of women who refused to be broken, who found ways to endure when endurance seemed impossible, who built lives from the ruins of their dreams. Their legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the stories that were finally being told, in the recognition that immigration was not always a tale of success and assimilation, but sometimes a story of loss and survival, and the complicated process of becoming someone new while mourning who you used to be. Greta's story, like the stories of thousands of other war brides, was a reminder that history was not just made by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people making impossible choices in extraordinary circumstances. It was a reminder that the cost of war extended far beyond the battlefield, touching the lives of women and children who had to pick up the pieces and find a way forward. And it was a reminder that strength came in many forms, not just in the dramatic gestures, but in the quiet daily decision to keep going, to survive one more day, to refuse to give up even when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. In 1947, thousands of German women crossed the Atlantic dreaming of American paradise. What they found instead broke some of them and forged others into something stronger than steel. Greta Hoffman was one of those women, and her story, finally told, stood as a testament to all the war brides who had lived through similar experiences, who had survived when survival seemed impossible, who had found ways to build lives from the ashes of their dreams.